style element. So we'll scroll to the top of our code to the head element, and then inside here, we'll create a style element. So the style element doesn't appear on the website. That's why we put it in the head section. And the special thing about the style element is we can write CSS code inside. In here, we'll type the CSS code button and curly brackets. And inside, we'll type background dash color colon green and semicolon. So this is some CSS code. As a review, this code at the front is called the CSS selector. This tells the computer which elements we want to change the appearance. And inside, we have CSS styles. This tells the computer how to change the appearance of these elements. The left side is called the CSS property. This is what we're changing. And the right side is called the CSS value. This is what we're changing the property to. So this code changes all buttons on the website and changes the background color to green. If we save and then check our website, you can see that it changed the background color of the button to green. Let's go back to our code. And one problem here is button will style all buttons on the website. But usually, we want to just style a specific button. For example, let's scroll down to the chat input component, and we're going to scroll down to this send button here. So let's say we just want to style this send button. As a review, to style a specific element, we can add an HTML attribute called class. In React, to set the class attribute, we're going to give this element a prop called class capital N name equals double quotes. And we'll give it the class send dash button. In React, we use class name to set the class. That's because React is actually just JavaScript code. And JavaScript already has a feature called class. So class is a reserved word, and we can't use it. That's why React uses class name to set the class. Now that this button has the class send-button, we can style this specific element. We'll go to our CSS, and in here, we're going to remove button, and we're going to type dot, and then the class send-button. As a review, if we start the CSS selector with a dot, it will only style elements with this class. So this will only style elements with the class send-button. If we save and check our website, it styles our send button because we gave it the send-button class. If we open the console and go to the Elements tab, and then we look at our HTML here, and we find the send button, you'll notice that it has the class attribute. So class name in React is converted to class in HTML. Now that we reviewed CSS, we're going to style this button to look like the final design. So first, we're going to put the final design and our website side by side, so it's easier to compare. So I'll take the final design here, and I'll put it on the bottom left, and I'll take our website and put it in the top left. And I'm going to resize our code editor so we can see everything side by side. And I'll hide the sidebar. Next, to style our send button to look like the final project, we just have to style it one by one with CSS. So we already made the background color green. Next, let's make the text color white. To do that, we'll type the CSS property color, colon, and set it to white, and save. And that will make the text color white. Next, let's make our button bigger. To do that, we'll add space on the inside of the button. As a review, space on the inside of an element is called padding. So in our CSS, we're going to add padding, colon, and we'll give the padding two values, 12px and 20px. So the px here stands for pixels. A pixel is a unit of measurement in computers. For example, my computer screen is about 3,800 pixels wide. So 12 pixels and 20 pixels looks like this. The first value is the vertical space inside this button. And the second value is the horizontal space inside this button. So we're going to add space all around the inside of this button. So let's save. And it adds space on the inside. And I think that looks close enough. Next, let's add some space on the outside of this button on the left. As a review, space on the outside of an element is called margin. So in our CSS, we'll add margin dash, and we'll add it on the left, colon, and let's add 10 pixels of margin, and save, and that looks close enough. Next, our button has a border around the button, but in the final design, there is no border. To remove the borders, we'll type the property border, colon, and set it to none, and save. And that will remove the borders. Next, the corners of the button in the final design are round. To make our corners round, we're going to use the CSS property border-radius, colon, and then how round we want the corners to be. Let's try 10 pixels and save. And I think that looks close enough. Next, the text in the button is a little bigger in the final design. To change the size of the text, we'll use the CSS property font-size, colon, and let's try 15 pixels, and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, if we put our mouse over our button, we no longer have the hand pointer icon that we see here. To use this hand pointer icon, we're going to set the property cursor, colon, pointer, and save. And now if we put our mouse over the button, we have the hand pointer icon again. Finally, the background color of our button is a little different from the final design. So to get this exact green color, we can go to the final project, and then we're going to right-click this button, and then click Inspect, and we can click these three dots here, and click this icon to open the console in a different window. And we're going to go to the Elements tab, and we'll find the Send button in the HTML, and we're going to look at these styles. So you can see that this button here has a background color of this RGB value. So we're going to select this RGB value, and we're going to copy it, and in our code, instead of the color green, we're going to paste this RGB color. As a review, RGB stands for red, green, blue, and it's a way to measure color in computers. Computers can create any color using a combination of red, green, and blue. The first value here is how much red we want in the color. The second value is how much green we want in the color. And the third value is how much blue we want. And each value goes from 0 to 255. So this color combines a little bit of red, a lot of green, and a bit of blue to get this exact green color. So let's save our code. And now our button matches the final project. And that's how we style the Send button. We just style it one by one using CSS. until it looks like the final design. So this is just a review of CSS. If you want to learn CSS in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. Next, we're going to style this text box to look like the final design. Again, we're just going to style it one by one with CSS. First, we need to add a class to this element so we can select it in our CSS. We'll go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to this text box, which is inside the chat input component, and it's this input element here. So to add a class, we're going to use class name. So inside the input element, we'll add a class name equals double quotes, and let's give it the class chat-input. Now let's scroll back up to the CSS, and below these styles, we're going to type dot to select a class, and we're going to select the class we just added, which is chat-input and curly brackets. And now we're ready to style the text box. The first thing we'll change is there's a lot of space on the inside of this text box in the final design. So again, space on the inside of an element is called padding. In our CSS, we'll add padding, colon, and let's do 12 pixels for the vertical space and 15 pixels for the horizontal space. Now let's save, and that adds space on the inside of our text box. And I think that looks close enough. Next, we'll make the corners round. To do that, we'll use border-radius, colon, and let's try 10 pixels, and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, our border is too thick compared to the final design. To change the thickness of the border, we'll use border-width, colon, and let's change it to 1 pixel, and save. So that looks pretty good. Finally, the text is bigger in the final design. To change the size of the text, we can use font-size, colon, and let's use 15 pixels again. So 15 px, and save. And I think that looks good enough for now. So we styled the text box one by one to look like the final design. Next, in the final design, the text box is wider. And this text box is also flexible. That means if we resize the browser, the text box will also resize. To make our text box flexible, we're going to review a feature of CSS called Flexbox. Flexbox lets us create a flexible layout. Layout means how the elements are positioned on the website. Here, we have a horizontal layout where the elements are beside each other. And also, this element is flexible. So Flexbox helps us create this flexible layout. To use Flexbox, we need to do 3 steps. The first step is to create a container around the elements that we want to position. So let's go back to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the chat input component, and we'll scroll down to the HTML. So here, we want to position the text box and the button. So we need to create a container around these 2 elements. Right now, we have a fragment around these 2 elements. However, we cannot style a fragment with CSS, since fragments don't actually appear on the website. Instead, we're going to switch this container to a div element, because we can style a div element. So inside here, we'll type div, and at the end, we'll do /div to convert this container to a div element. And now we have a container around the elements. The second step is to add the property display flex to the container. First, let's add a class name to this container so we can select it in our CSS. In here, we'll type class name equals double quotes, and we'll give it the class chat-input-container. And then we'll scroll up to our CSS. And at the end, we'll type dot to select a class, and we'll select the class chat-input-container and curly brackets. And finally, we'll add the property display::flex. And that will turn this container into a flexbox. The third step is to use flexbox features. Flexbox has many features we can use to control the layout or to control how these elements are positioned. One feature is called flex grow. Flex grow makes an element grow and take up the remaining space. So here, we want this text box to grow and take up this remaining space. So we'll go to the styles for the chat input or the text box, and we'll add the property flex-grow:1 and save. And now the text box will grow and take up the remaining space. If we resize the browser, the text box will also resize to take up the remaining space. So now we created the layout for the chat input that we see in the final design. Next, we'll create the layout for the overall app. Notice in the final project, if we resize the browser and make it wider, the app is limited to a certain width, so it's not going to get wider. To create this in our project, we'll set a maximum width for our app. So let's go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the app component, which is down here, and we'll go down to the HTML. And currently, the app is contained in a fragment. And remember, we cannot style a fragment, since fragments don't actually appear on the website. So again, we're going to switch this to a div element so we can style it. So in here, we'll type div, and at the bottom, we'll type /div. And now we can style this. First, we'll add a class to this div using class name equals double quotes, and let's give it the class app-container. And we'll scroll up to our CSS. And at the bottom here, we'll type dot to select a class, and we'll select the class app-container and curly brackets. And to set a maximum width of our app, we can just use the property max-width, and let's try 600 pixels, and save. So now if we resize our browser, the app will be limited to 600 pixels, just like the final design. Next, in the final design, notice that the app is centered on the website. Now, there are several ways to center an element in CSS. One way is to use margin. So we'll go back to our code, and in the app container, we're going to add the property margin-left, and we'll set it to auto. And we'll also set the margin-right, auto. So this will automatically add a space on the left and right of this element until it is centered. So if we save our code and check our website, you'll notice that the entire app is now centered on the website. And now we created the layout for the overall app. Next, we're going to create the layout for the chat messages. If you don't have any chat messages in your final project, you can add some by typing in here and then pressing send. So notice that the chat messages from the user are on the right, while the chat messages from the robot are on the left. So we're going to create this layout. First, we need to give class names to these chat messages so we can style them. So let's resize our browser for now, and we'll go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the chat message component, and we'll scroll down to the HTML. And we'll give each chat message a class name equals, and we're going to do something different this time. We'll type curly brackets. So here, we want to give a different class name depending on if the sender is the user or the sender is the robot. This will let us position the chat messages differently on the right or on the left. To give this a different class name depending on the sender, we're going to use a feature of JavaScript called the ternary operator. As a review, the ternary operator looks like this, and it works like an if-else statement. If value 1 is true, then the result is value 2. Else, the result is value 3. The ternary operator lets us insert an if-else statement directly in the JSX. So using a ternary operator, we can give a different class name depending on the sender. Inside here, we're going to type the if condition. So we'll check if the sender is equal to the string user. And then we'll type question mark. If the sender is the user, we'll set the class name to the string chat-message-user. And then we'll type a colon. So this means else. So if the sender is not the user, we're going to give the class name the string chat-message-robot. So again, the way this code works is if the sender is equal to user, we'll set the class name to chat-message-user. Else, we'll set the class name to chat-message-robot. As you can see, the ternary operator lets us insert an if-else statement directly in the JSX. And notice that we used curly brackets here because we want to save the result of this code into class name instead of just a string. Before we continue, we can add some new lines to this code to make it easier to read. So at the beginning, we can add a new line, and then we'll add a new line before the question mark and press tab. And we'll add a new line before the colon. And we'll add a new line at the back. And remove some spaces so that this is vertically aligned. So this makes the code a bit easier to read. We have the if condition, and then the first value, and then else, the second value. Now let's save, and we'll go to our website, and let's check the HTML. So in our console, we can click these three dots here, and then click this icon to open the console in another window. And we'll go to the Elements tab, and we'll click this pointer on the top left, and we'll select one of these chat messages and click it. And if we scroll down here, you can see that each chat message now has a class. And messages from the user have the class chat-message-user, and messages from the robot have the class chat-message-robot. So now that we added a class to each of these chat messages, let's style these chat messages. We'll go to our code, and we'll scroll up to our CSS. And at the end, let's type a dot. And first, let's select the class chat-message-user and curly brackets. And now for chat message user, we want to position these elements, the text and the profile image, on the right. To create this flexible layout, we can use Flexbox again. Remember, there are 3 steps to use Flexbox. First, we already have a container around the elements. It has a class chatMessageUser or chatMessageRobot. Next, we need to add displayFlex to this container. So for chatMessageUser, we'll add display::flex. And now we can use Flexbox features. Another feature of Flexbox is we're going to type justify-content: Justify content controls how the elements are displayed horizontally. If we want these elements to be displayed on the right, we're going to give this a value end. So it will display these elements at the end of this row or on the right. So now let's save our code. And now the chat messages from the user are on the right. And we created the layout for the chat messages. Next, we're going to style the text in the chat messages. First, we need to add a class name to this text so we can style it. Let's go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the chat message component, and we're going to scroll to the text, which is here. So currently, this text is not inside an element. So first, we're going to put this text inside an element so that we can style just the text. Above this, we'll put this in a div by typing less than div greater than, and below it, less than / div greater than. And we'll add an indent at the front to show that this text is inside this div. And now let's add a class to this div so we can style just the text. So we'll give this a class name equals double quotes, and let's give it the class chat-message-text. So now let's style this with CSS. We'll scroll up to our CSS, and at the end, we'll type a dot, and we'll style the class chat-message-text and curly brackets. So the first thing we'll style is we're going to change the background color to this gray color. To get this exact color, we're going to right-click on this text and then click Inspect. And we'll find this text in the Elements tab, and we're going to go into the Styles, and we'll get the background color. So we'll copy this RGB color, and we'll go into our code, and we'll set the background-color, and we'll paste the RGB color, and save. And now we'll have the exact color in our final design. However, after we saved, it kind of messed up our layout. So the chat message user looks okay, but the text for chat message robot is now appearing below the profile image, and it's taking up the entire line. So what happened? Remember that we just surrounded this text in a div element. Normally, a div element takes up an entire line by itself because a div is a block element. However, remember that we also made chat message user a flexbox. When a block element is inside a flexbox, it no longer takes up the entire line. It only takes up as much space as it needs to. So that's why this div only takes up as much space as it needs, because it's inside a flexbox. One way to fix this layout problem is we can make chat message robot a flexbox as well. We'll go back to our code, and below chat message user, let's type dot, and we'll style the chat-message-robot and curly brackets. And we'll also give it display::flex. so it will match the layout for the chat message user. Let's save. And now, because this div is inside a flexbox, it only takes up as much space as it needs. So now the background color and the layout looks good. Next, the style of text or the font is different in the final design. To change the font, we'll go to our code and we'll add the property font-family, and in the final project, I use the font Arial. Let's save. And now our font matches the final design. Now, usually we don't set the font for just one element. We set the font for the entire website because we want the entire website to use the same font or the same style of text. To set the font for the entire website, we can style the body element. So we'll scroll to the top of our CSS. And here, we'll style the body element, curly brackets, and we'll set the font-family to Arial. So this sets the font for all elements inside the body, which is basically the entire website. So now we can scroll back down and we can remove this style because we're going to set the font for the entire website instead. Let's save. And now we set the font for the entire website to Arial. Next, let's add space on the inside of this text, which is padding. So here, we'll add padding, and let's try 15 pixels of vertical space and 20 pixels of horizontal space, and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, we'll make the corners round. To do that, we'll use border-radius, and 10 pixels, and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, let's add space on the outside of the text on the right. So we'll add margin dash right, and let's try 10 pixels, and save. And that looks close enough. And here, if we scroll down to a chat message from the robot, we'll add some space on the left of the text. So in our code, we'll add margin dash left. And let's try 10 pixels and save. And that looks pretty good. Finally, let's add some space on the bottom of the text so we can separate them. Here, we'll add margin dash bottom, and let's try 20 pixels and save. And I think that looks close enough. However, we now have a problem here, which is the profile image seems to be stretching. This happens because this container is a flexbox, and by default, elements inside a flexbox will stretch vertically. So if this text gets longer because we added some margin, this image will stretch. To fix this, Flexbox has another feature called Align Items. So in our CSS, in chat message user, we'll add the property align-items, and align items controls how the elements are displayed vertically. By default, align items is stretch. That's why the elements stretch vertically. Instead, we're going to change align items to start. This will display the elements at the start or at the top vertically, and it will no longer stretch. Same thing for the chat message robot. We're going to give it align-items, start, and save. And now the elements in the flexbox will appear at the start or at the top vertically. The last thing we'll style for the text is if we go to our final project and inside the text box, we type test and press send. You'll notice that the response from the chatbot has a maximum width. So in our project, we're also going to add a maximum width to our text. So in our code, we'll go to the chat message text and let's add a max dash width colon, and let's try 300 pixels and save. And now if we go to our text box and type test and press send and scroll down, the text has a maximum width and it matches the final design. Now we finish styling the text in the chat messages. Next, we'll style the profile images. So in our code, let's scroll down to the profile image, which is inside the chat message component. And it's these two image elements here. Currently, we're using an attribute to set the width of this image. However, a best practice is to use CSS for styling instead of attributes. So let's remove this attribute, and we'll remove it down here as well. And we'll add a class to these profile images so that we can style them with CSS. So here, we'll add class name equals double quotes, and we'll give it the class chat-message-profile. And we'll also add this class to the profile image for the user. We'll give it the class name equals double quotes chat-message-profile. So now we can style this with our CSS. We'll scroll up to our CSS, and at the end, we'll type a dot, and we'll style the class chat-message-profile and curly brackets. So previously, we set the width to 50 pixels. So let's do that again using CSS this time. We'll set the width colon to 50 pixels and save. Now, if we look at the final design, it looks like the profile images here are a little bit smaller than our profile images. So let's make this width smaller. Let's try 45 pixels instead and save. And I think that looks close enough. And now our profile images are the same size as the final design. The last thing we're going to change in this design is we're going to move the text box to the bottom so that it matches the design of other popular chatbots. In the final project, we're going to make this a little taller now. We can move this text box to the bottom of the page by clicking this link. And now let's create this design in our project. First, I'll open our project and then move it back to the same window so that we can see this side by side a little easier. And to put the text box at the bottom of the page, the first step is to move the text box below the chat messages. We'll go to our code and we're going to scroll down to the app component, which is here. And we'll scroll to the HTML, and we're just going to move this chat input below the chat messages. So we'll select this component, and we'll cut, and below chat messages, we'll paste, and save. And now the chat input will be below the chat messages, and that looks pretty good. Next, we also want to put this chat input at the bottom of the browser here. So there are several ways to do this in CSS. One way is to use Flexbox again. Now, before we use Flexbox, we're going to make the app container stretch to the bottom of the browser. So right now, if we click inside here and we right click and inspect, and we go to the Elements tab and we scroll up and look at the app container, notice that the app container stops at the chat input section. And that's because this is all the content that we have. So the app container only has the height that it needs. However, we want to stretch the app container to the bottom of the browser so that we can put the chat input at the bottom. To do that, we're going to set the height of the app container. So we'll go back to our code and we'll scroll up to our CSS and we're going to find the styles for the app container, which is right here. And at the end, we're going to set the height, colon. And now we want the height of the app container to stretch to be the same as the height of the browser here. To do that,